Hi, I'm Ben. I once watched a Top Gun pilot, a man they called Viper, laugh right at my 10-year-old daughter, Lena. He did it while standing in front of his grounded F-35, a useless hunk of metal silenced by a sandstorm and sophisticated enemy jamming. We were all trapped in a remote mountain valley, completely blind and waiting for an attack that felt inevitable. That pilot, with all his training and bravado, saw my daughter as nothing more than a civilian annoyance in his high-tech world. Little did he know, the only person on that entire godforsaken base who could save his squadron was the little girl he had just dismissed. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the key to solving everyone's problem? Before I tell you how Lena used nothing but a strange pattern she saw in a tiny blinking light to reboot that fighter jet's entire navigation system, do me a favor and comment where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Believe me when I say this, you are not going to want to miss the look of pure, unadulterated shock on Viper's face when the tactical map of the valley suddenly blinked back to life on his screen. It was a moment of silence, so profound you could hear the sand scraping against the hangar doors, a silence that changed everything for us on that base, forever. Our world had shrunk to the size of forward operating base Eagle's Perch, a miserable collection of tents and metal containers dropped into a canyon that felt like the edge of the world. The sandstorm wasn't just weather, it was a physical enemy. It had descended on us without warning, a thick, suffocating wall of brown that turned day into a perpetual twilight. The wind howled with a personality, a malevolent force that seeped through every crack and coated every surface in a fine, gritty dust. The worst part, though, was the silence. The radios were dead, filled with nothing but the crackle of enemy jamming. An entire squadron of the most advanced fighter jets on the planet was grounded, blind and utterly vulnerable. And in the middle of all that tension was my daughter, Lena. She's always been different. Quiet, intensely observant, she doesn't see the world like the rest of us. Her mother, a brilliant software engineer we lost a couple of years back, used to design these incredibly complex logic puzzles for her. That was Lena's playground. She never learned about wrenches or wiring diagrams. She learned about systems, patterns and logical flow. To the pilots and engineers, she was just a piece of civilian baggage, a quiet little girl who was always underfoot. They saw a shy kid in a dusty corner, not the mind that was already mapping the invisible prison that held them all captive. The two men in charge of this mess were Lieutenant Viper Jackson and Chief Warrant Officer Miles. Viper was the squadron leader, a man whose arrogance was usually backed up by skill, but now it had curdled into a bitter, simmering rage. He paced the hangar like a caged animal, his pride wounded more deeply than any physical injury. Miles, the lead avionics engineer, was the opposite. He was a 20-year veteran, a man who knew these jets inside and out, but he was just defeated. I saw him slumped over a diagnostics tablet, his face pale with exhaustion, surrounded by manuals and schematics that were all telling him the same thing. Nothing was working. Their frustration was a heavy blanket over the entire base. The new problem itself was a nightmare. It wasn't just that the GPS was jammed, that was common. The enemy had somehow slipped a logic bomb into the F-35 software. Every time they tried to reboot the navigation system, it would fall into an infinite diagnostic loop, a snake eating its own tail. The system wasn't technically broken, it was just stuck, endlessly checking for an error it could never resolve. They tried every procedure in the book, hard resets, cold boots, system purges, but nothing worked. The jets were perfect machines, trapped in a perfect digital cage, and the pilots, men who ruled the skies, were now just as lost and grounded as the rest of us, waiting. I tried to make myself and Lena as small as possible, to shrink into the background of the cavernous hangar. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and the bitter scent of failure. Viper and Miles were at the center of it all, their argument a low, vicious storm that mirrored the one outside. "We've run every diagnostic in the manual, Lieutenant," Miles yelled, his voice cracking with exhaustion as he slammed a heavy binder onto a metal crate. Viper, coiled with a predator's energy, just glared at him. "The manual is for standard failures, Chief. This isn't standard. This is a goddamn ambush in slow motion." Their anger radiated outwards, infecting every soldier and technician in the room. We weren't just civilians. We were witnesses to their professional unraveling, an audience for their humiliation. It was during one of these heated moments that Lena, drawn by some invisible string, drifted a little too close to the cockpit of Viper's jet. She wasn't touching anything, just standing on her tiptoes, peering at a small, blinking light on a secondary console that no one else was paying attention to. Miles spotted her. "Hey, get away from there," he roared, his voice echoing in the hangar. It wasn't a warning. It was an accusation. He strode over, his face a mask of fury and frustration, and for a second I thought he might grab her. I rushed forward, my heart pounding, and pulled Lena back. "I'm so sorry, Chief. She didn't mean any harm," I stammered, feeling my face burn with shame. He just shot me a look of pure contempt, as if our very presence was the source of all his problems. Viper saw the whole exchange. He didn't shout. He did something worse. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound completely devoid of humor. He turned to the pilot next to him, speaking, just loud enough for half the hangar to hear. "Can you believe this? The world is ending and we're running a daycare?" The other pilot just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. The words hit me like a physical blow. Daycare. That's what we were. Not people trapped in a war zone, but an inconvenience, a burden. I held Lena's hand tighter, feeling a hot, useless anger rise in my throat. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that my daughter was smarter than he could possibly imagine, but the words died before they could form. In that world, he was a god and I was less than nothing. I looked down at Lena, expecting to see tears welling up in her eyes, or at least the crushed look of a child who has just been publicly shamed. But there was nothing. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at Viper or Miles. She wasn't even looking at me. Her gaze was still fixed on the jet, her eyes narrowed in concentration. It was as if their insults were just background. Noise, irrelevant data that her mind had already filtered out and discarded. She was processing something far more important. She was listening to the machine, not the men. In that moment I realized with a jolt that while I was focused on her feelings, she was focused on the puzzle. The injustice didn't break her. It just made her more determined to solve it. The engineers, meanwhile, were stuck in their own loop of futility. They were following their training to the letter, treating the F-35 like a car with a dead battery. I watched them for an hour as they physically replaced a multi-million-dollar avionics module, a massive, back-breaking task that required 3 people and a small crane. They heaved and sweated, their faces grim with determination, certain that a hardware swap would fix the software glitch. It was like trying to cure a virus by replacing the patient's brain. When they finally powered the system back on, the result was exactly the same error message. The same infinite diagnostic loop. The collective groan of despair in that hangar was the most soul-crushing sound I had ever heard. Their rulebook had failed them completely. Then, for a fleeting moment, a spark of hope ignited the gloom. A young tech, barely out of his teens, suggested a complex manual reboot sequence he'd read about on some obscure forum for legacy systems. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary. But at that point, they were willing to try anything. Viper and Miles gathered. Everyone around the main terminal, their animosity temporarily forgotten. The tech's fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting a long string of commands. The main screen flickered. For a second, a command prompt appeared, clean and promising. A wave of relief washed over the room, and then it was gone, replaced by a single line of red text. Fatal system error, kernel panic. The system wasn't just stuck anymore, it was completely dead. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. That was the moment I felt true despair sink in, not just for our safety but for Lena. I looked at my daughter, this quiet little genius who saw patterns in the chaos, and I saw the men who held our lives in their hands treat her like dirt. A part of me, the father, wanted to grab her and hide in the deepest, safest corner of the base until this was all over. But another part of me, the part that had seen her solve my wife's impossible puzzles, knew she was seeing something they weren't. I was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to protect her from their arrogance and the terrifying growing certainty that she held the key. Speaking up felt like an impossible risk, but staying silent felt like a betrayal of the one person who might actually be able to get us out of there. The failure of the manual reboot broke something in the room. The simmering anger and frantic energy just evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy silence that was more terrifying than any shouting. I saw men, elite soldiers and technicians, just slump where they stood. Some sat down hard on ammo crates, others just stared blankly at the dead terminal screen, their faces hollow. It was the quiet acceptance of defeat, the moment you know you're truly trapped. I held Lena's hand, feeling the cold dread seep into my own bones. We weren't just in a dangerous place, we were in a place without hope, surrounded by the most advanced technology on Earth, which had become nothing more than a collection of very expensive tombs. The storm outside seemed to mock our silence, its howl the only sign of life. The quiet was finally shattered by Viper. He strode over to Miles, his movements stiff with a new kind of energy, not anger, but pure, unadulterated desperation. "That's it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're flying out. Blind." Miles looked up at him, his face ashen. "Are you insane, Lieutenant? We'll clip a canyon wall before we clear 1,000 feet. That's not a plan." "It's suicide." Viper got right in his face. "Staying here is suicide. You think the enemy doesn't know we're here? They're just waiting for the storm to clear so they can pick us off like fish in a barrel. I'd rather die in the sky than wait for it on the ground." The men around them just watched, too defeated to even react to the madness of the suggestion. It was in that moment, as the two most powerful men on the base were locked in a battle of wills, that I felt a gentle tug on my hand. I looked down, and Lena was pulling away from me. Her eyes weren't on the arguing men or the defeated soldiers. They were fixed, with an almost hypnotic intensity, on Viper's F-35. There was no fear in her face, only a profound and unsettling focus. Something had clicked in her mind. My first instinct was to pull her back, to shield her, to tell her to stay put. But I stopped. I saw the look in her eyes, the same look her mother had when she was on the verge of solving a particularly difficult problem. And in that split second I made a choice. I let her go. She moved through the hangar like a little ghost. No one paid her any attention. The engineers were packing up their diagnostic tools with the slow, grim movements of pallbearers. Viper and Miles were still locked in their stalemate, their voices a low, angry buzz. Lena drifted silently toward the massive fighter jet, her small form a stark contrast to the hulking grey machine. She didn't look at the missiles under the wings or the giant engine exhaust. She stopped right beside the cockpit ladder, her head tilted, looking up. I followed her gaze and realized she wasn't looking at the cockpit as a whole, but at one specific point inside it. That tiny, insignificant console light, still blinking its frantic, nonsensical rhythm into the gloom of the dead cockpit. Then she started to climb. My heart leaped into my throat, a cold, hard knot of pure terror. Each step she took up that metal ladder felt like a drumbeat counting, down to disaster. I wanted to scream her name, to run and pull her down before Miles or Viper saw her. The humiliation from before was still fresh, a raw wound in my memory. But I was frozen, pinned in place by a strange mixture of fear and a wild, irrational hope. It felt like I was watching her step off a cliff, but some deeper instinct told me she knew exactly where she was going to land. I just stood there, holding my breath, a silent, terrified accomplice to whatever she was about to do. I had let go of her hand, and now there was no turning back. From my angle, I could just see the top of her head as she settled into the pilot's seat. She was so small in that cavernous cockpit, her sneakers dangling high above the rudder pedals. She didn't touch the main flight stick or the throttle. She didn't even look at the big, dark primary flight display that had been the source of all the engineers' frustration. Instead, she leaned forward, her face just inches from a small, secondary touchscreen off to the side, the one that controlled things like cabin temperature and oxygen mix, the environmental controls. It was a part of the jet so mundane that no one had even thought to look at it. I watched as her small finger hovered over the screen, her movement slow, deliberate, and full of a purpose I couldn't comprehend. The argument between Viper and Miles finally broke. Viper, disgusted, turned away from the engineer with a curse. He took a few steps, running a hand over his face in pure frustration, his eyes scanning the hangar for something, a solution, an escape. And then he stopped. He went completely still, his body rigid. His gaze was locked onto his F-35. I saw his eyes narrow, and a look of disbelief, quickly followed by cold, sharp fury, washed over his face. He had seen her. He had seen my 10-year-old daughter sitting in the command seat of his multi-million-dollar fighter jet. He didn't shout. He just started walking towards the plane, each step, measured and heavy with menace. The silence in the hangar was about to be broken, and I was sure it would be with a sound I would never forget. I scrambled forward, my legs feeling like lead weights, my voice a useless croak in my throat. "Lieutenant, I'm so sorry, she just—" I started to say, but Viper didn't even look at me. He was focused entirely on Lena. He reached the ladder and placed a hand on the rung, his knuckles white. "Get out of my cockpit. Now," he snarled, each word a low, sharp icicle of pure rage. He wasn't just angry, he was personally insulted. He saw it as the ultimate violation, a child playing in the sacred temple of his profession while he was at his lowest point. He started to climb, his intent clear. He was going to physically pull her out of that seat, and I was utterly powerless to stop him. The entire hangar had fallen silent, all eyes locked on this terrible, unfolding drama. Just as Viper's head rose above the cockpit's edge, I reached the base of the ladder and grabbed Lena's dangling leg. "Lena, honey, come on down now, please," I begged, my voice shaking. My only thought was to get her away from him, to shield her from the explosion of fury I knew was coming. The humiliation was one thing, but this felt dangerous. I pulled gently, trying to coax her out of the seat before Viper could. It was pure instinct, the desperate act of a father trying to protect his child from a threat he couldn't fight. I didn't care about the jet or the jamming anymore. All I cared about was getting her small, fragile body away from the epicenter of that man's wrath. My world had shrunk to that single, terrifying objective. But she wouldn't budge. She resisted my pull, not with strength, but with a stubborn stillness. I looked up and saw her face. She was looking down at me, her expression not one of fear, but of intense, desperate pleading. She shook her head once, a sharp, definitive motion. Then she pointed one small finger at the secondary touchscreen, and with her other hand she pointed to the tiny, blinking error light on the other console. Her eyes darted between the two, then back to me. She was trying to communicate something, to show me the connection she had seen. It was a silent, frantic message. "Don't you see? It's not random. It's a conversation. Just let me listen." In that moment, she wasn't a scared child. She was an expert, trying to explain a complex theory to a panicked layman. Viper was now in the cockpit, looming over her. I could hear his sharp intake of breath, ready to unleash his fury. "What the hell do you think you're—" he began. But Lena, ignoring him completely, acted. With a speed that stunned me, her finger tapped the environmental screen 3 times on the temperature control, then twice on the air circulation icon. It was a meaningless sequence to anyone else, but as she did it, I saw it. The frantic, irregular blinking of the small error light across the console faltered for a split. Second, it settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4. A calm, orderly beat in the heart of the chaos. It only lasted a second before reverting to its frantic flickering, but I had seen it. It was real. A tiny, undeniable proof of concept. A surge of adrenaline, of something other than fear, shot through me. I let go of her leg and looked straight up at Viper, who was frozen, his hand hovering over Lena's shoulder. "Wait," I said, my voice suddenly clear and steady. The word hung in the air, echoing slightly in the vast silent space. "Please, just give her 1 minute." Viper stared down at me, his face a mask of utter disbelief. "Are you insane?" he spat. I shook my head, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What do you have to lose?" I pleaded, my voice raw with a desperation that matched his own. "Everything you've tried has failed. Your engineers are beaten. You're talking about a suicide run. Just give her 60 seconds, please. What if she's seeing something?" "You're not?" Viper stood there for what felt like an eternity, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching in his cheek. He looked from my pleading face to the small girl in his seat, who was now looking at him with a calm, unwavering focus. He glanced at the dead main display, a monument to his failure, and then back at Lena. I saw the war in his eyes, pride versus desperation, logic versus a sliver of impossible hope. The hangar was so quiet, I could hear the sand hissing against the metal roof. Finally, with a sound that was half groan, half surrender, he let his hand drop. He stepped back, giving her space. 1 minute, he bit out, his voice gravelly. "You have 60 seconds. Then I'm throwing you both out of this hangar myself." The weight of that single minute descended on the hangar, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. Every soldier, Every technician, every pilot, they were all watching. Their skepticism was a tangible force, but it was mixed with a tiny, fragile spark of curiosity. Viper stood over Lena like a hawk, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Miles had come closer, his expression a mixture of scorn and bewilderment. I stayed at the bottom of the ladder, my hands clenched into fists, my gaze fixed on my daughter. It wasn't just about fixing a jet anymore. It was about her. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or laughed at. The fate of the entire squadron rested on the small, steady hands of my 10-year-old daughter. The countdown had begun. Lena's fingers hovered over the environmental screen, a tiny island of calm in a sea of frantic, military-grade tension. She ignored Viper's intimidating presence, the 60-second clock he had started, and the dozens of skeptical eyes watching her every move. Her first tap was on the temperature control, pushing it up 3 degrees. Then she tapped the screen for the canopy defroster, a function utterly useless in the middle of a sandstorm. It was a bizarre, nonsensical sequence. I could hear Miles let out a short, contemptuous huff from the hangar floor. Viper's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin with every precious second that ticked by. I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. I had vouched for her, and now I was certain I had just set her up for the biggest humiliation of her young life in front of an entire squadron. She was completely unbothered by the pressure, her focus absolute. Her next taps were a quick, rhythmic pattern on the air circulation controls. A little melody played on a touchscreen. It was so deliberate, so confident, that it sent a strange shiver down my spine. She wasn't guessing or playing around. She was executing a command sequence she already knew. I had a sudden, vivid memory of her mother showing me one of her logic puzzles, explaining that the most complex systems always had a backdoor, a hidden master key disguised as a meaningless function. Lena wasn't trying to repair the jets. Navigation. She was talking to its soul, using a forgotten language of pure logic that the engineers, with all their manuals and procedures, had never learned. The frantic error light flickered, its chaotic rhythm faltering for just a moment. Viper's patience finally snapped. He took a heavy step forward inside the cramped cockpit, his shadow falling over my daughter. "That's it. Time's up," he growled, his voice a low threat. He reached down, his hand open, ready to physically lift her from the seat and end the bizarre spectacle. But just as his fingers were about to close around her small shoulder, Lena performed her final decisive action. With a steady hand, she placed her index finger on a blank corner of the secondary screen, a spot with no icon, no label, nothing. She just held it there. For a second that stretched into an eternity, nothing happened. The error light resumed its spastic blinking. The low electronic hum of the auxiliary power continued unchanged. The fragile hope in the hangar died instantly, and I heard Miles sigh, "A waste of time." Then everything went dark. Not just the small screen Lena was touching, but every single light in the cockpit. The main flight display, the backup instruments, the glowing buttons on the throttle, all of it just vanished into absolute blackness. The low hum of the jet's auxiliary power cut out, plunging the hangar into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Viper snatched his hand back, as if the console had shocked him. His face, illuminated only by the dim hangar lights, was a mask of sheer horror. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The anger was gone, replaced by the chilling realization that a 10-year-old girl might have just permanently destroyed his multi-million-dollar aircraft. My heart didn't just sink. It plummeted into a black abyss. This was a catastrophe. The silence stretched for 5, maybe 10 seconds, an eternity filled with the suffocating weight of complete and utter failure. I saw Chief Miles stagger back a step, his face pale, his mouth hanging open. I could feel the collective stare of every person in that hangar, a laser beam of accusation aimed directly at me and my daughter. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the explosion of rage that was sure to come. But instead of shouting, a soft click echoed from the cockpit. Then another, a low electronic hum, a sound no one had heard for 2 days, began to fill the space. My eyes snapped open. On the main flight display, a single line of crisp green text had appeared. System kernel initializing. It wasn't an error. It was a clean boot. The system wasn't broken. It was being reborn. The main screen exploded with life, lines of white text scrolling by faster than the eye could follow. System diagnostics flashed on the screen, each one followed by a green "Passed." The engineers, who had been slumped in defeat, were now on their feet, pointing and staring in stunned disbelief. The high system wasn't falling into the diagnostic loop. It wasn't stuck. It was running a clean, uncorrupted boot sequence, completely bypassing the enemy's digital trap. The scrolling code vanished, replaced by the F-35's familiar, sleek interface. Then a calm, synthetic female voice, a sound of impossible hope, filled the cockpit and echoed through the hangar's speakers. Navigation system online. Acquiring satellite link. A pause. Link established. Tactical map populated. On the massive primary display, a crisp three-dimensional map of the valley bloomed into existence. A bright, solid blue line traced a clear and safe escape route through the treacherous mountain passes. The jamming was gone. The error was gone. The system was perfect. Viper stood frozen, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the screen. He looked from the flawless tactical map to the small girl sitting calmly in his command seat, and then back again. The arrogance, the anger, the despair, it all just dissolved from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated, world-shattering awe. Chief Miles just stood there, his hands on his head, staring as if he'd witnessed a miracle. The laughter was gone. In the deafening silence of the hangar, the only sound was the quiet, steady hum of a machine brought back from the dead. Viper didn't say a word. He just stood there, a statue in his own cockpit, staring at the glowing map that represented salvation. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, sandblasted away by the sheer undeniable reality of what had just happened. He slowly lowered himself onto the edge of the seat next to Lena, not as a superior officer, but as a humbled student. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a question he didn't know how to ask. Then he looked at me, at the base of the ladder, and for the first time he didn't see an inconvenience. He saw the father of the person who had just saved his entire squadron. The silence in the hangar wasn't one of tension anymore. It was one of reverence, a sacred quiet that acknowledged the impossible had just occurred. Before the squadron prepared to leave, something unforgettable happened. Viper gathered everyone near his jet. He stood in front of Lena, who looked so small, surrounded by all those tall pilots in their flight gear. He didn't make a big speech. He just reached up and with a slow, deliberate motion, tore the official squadron patch from the Velcro on his flight suit, the roaring Viper insignia that was a symbol of his identity and his authority. He knelt, getting down on her level, a gesture of respect I never thought I'd see from a man like him. He held out the patch. "We call ourselves the Vipers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you, Lena, you're the real navigator." He gently pressed the patch into her small hand, a silent, powerful apology and the highest honor he could bestow. Chief Miles had his own way of showing his respect. The next morning, as the storm began to clear, he found us by the water purifiers. He didn't say much. He never was a man of many words, but he was carrying a small, specialized toolkit, the kind reserved for delicate electronics. He handed it to Lena, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. "The workshop is always open to you," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact, but his meaning was clear. "If you ever see something you think we're missing, you just come and find me." It was more than an invitation. It was a concession. It was a 20-year veteran, admitting that his rulebook wasn't the only one that mattered, and that sometimes the most brilliant engineer in the room isn't the one with the most experience, but the one with a different way of seeing. In the hours that followed, the entire dynamic of the base shifted. Pilots, men who had smirked at her just a day before, would approach Lena with a kind of quiet awe. They'd show her their tablets with strange diagnostic readings, not expecting her to fix them, but just to look, as if her eyes alone might reveal a secret they were missing. They started calling her the Navigator, a title spoken with genuine reverence. She was no longer a piece of civilian baggage, an invisible child in a world of warriors. She had become a quiet legend, the ghost in the machine who had whispered the secret of escape into the ear of a dying fighter jet. She never said much back, just offered a small, shy smile, but she walked through that hangar with a new confidence, the silent hero of Eagles. Perch. I watched it all unfold, My heart a painful, wonderful mix of pride and relief. The fear that had been my constant companion in that valley was replaced by a profound awe for my own daughter. Seeing Viper, a man who represented everything that had ever made me feel small and powerless, kneel before Lena and give her his own patch, it broke something open inside me. The tears I'd been holding back for days finally streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of fear or shame. They were tears of pure, unadulterated pride. In that moment, I wasn't just her protector anymore. I was a witness to her brilliance, and I understood that my job wasn't to shield her from the world, but to make sure the world was ready for her. As the F-35s roared to life, their engines a thunderous chorus of victory, I stood with my arm around Lena's shoulders, watching them taxi to the runway. Each jet in turn dipped a wing as it passed us, a pilot's salute. Viper was in the lead, and as he thundered past, he looked down from his cockpit and gave a short, sharp nod. It was a final acknowledgement, a promise that he would never forget. They took to the skies, a perfect formation, following the exact escape route that had bloomed to life under my daughter's touch. They vanished into the newly cleared blue sky, leaving us in the quiet valley, forever changed by the storm, the silence, and the little girl who saw a puzzle where everyone else saw only a dead end. If you know someone who has ever been underestimated or needs to hear this message of trusting their own unique way of seeing the world, please share this video with them, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how the most unexpected people can find the most incredible solutions. Thank you for listening. After the roar of the F-35s faded into the horizon, a new kind of silence fell over Eagle's Perch. It wasn't the dead, oppressive quiet of the jamming anymore. This was a peaceful silence, filled with the soft whisper of the wind through the canyon, a sound we could finally appreciate. The remaining ground crew moved with a different energy, no longer frantic or defeated, but calm and purposeful. The hangar, once a tomb of failed technology, felt more like a monument now, a monument to a single moment that had defied all logic and protocol. Lena and I would walk through it sometimes, and I could still feel the echo of what had happened, the tension, the fear, and the stunning, beautiful release. The world had almost ended for us in that place, and it had been saved not by a weapon, but by a child's unique perspective. That day changed me more than anyone. For 2 days, my only goal had been to make Lena invisible, to keep her quiet and out of the way of important men. I thought I was protecting her, but I was really just protecting myself from their judgment. I was so afraid of their authority, their titles, their anger, that I almost silenced the one voice that mattered. When I saw her in that cockpit, my first instinct was fear of what they would do to her. I failed to see that she wasn't in danger. She was in her element. I learned that my job as her father wasn't to shield her from the world's sharp edges, but to be the one person who always, without question, believes that she is sharp enough to handle them herself. That was a hard, humbling lesson. Lena didn't change, not really. She didn't become talkative or boastful. She was still my quiet, observant girl, but something inside her had settled. The squadron patch Viper gave her wasn't a trophy she showed off. She kept it tucked away in a small box with her mother's old puzzles. The toolkit from Miles became her most prized possession, and she'd spend hours in the workshop, not building big things, but just taking small broken devices apart and putting them back together, understanding them. The event didn't make her arrogant, it gave her permission to be herself. It was the world's acknowledgement that her strange, quiet way of seeing things wasn't a flaw, but a gift. She no longer had to hide it, and in that freedom she seemed to stand a little taller. We left that valley a few weeks later, but the lesson from Eagle's Perch never left me. I saw firsthand that the most experienced experts, with all their manuals and procedures, can be completely blind to a solution that's right in front of them. They look for the answers they've been trained to find. They were trying to fix a machine, but Lena saw a conversation. She saw a puzzle. That day, a squadron of elite warriors learned that true genius doesn't wear a uniform or come with a rank. It can be found in the quietest corners, in the minds of those the world is too quick to dismiss. Sometimes, the only way to solve an impossible problem is to listen to the person who isn't afraid to see it differently. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who has ever been made to feel invisible or had their unique talent overlooked, please share this story with them. It might be the reminder they need that their perspective matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength, especially when no one else sees it. Thank you for listening to What Happened to Us, and for letting us share the story of the navigator of Eagle's Perch. It's a story that deserves to be heard.